That's just a little sprinkling of the activities going on around the country in response to the U.S. bombing of Afghanistan and Sudan last week. We're going to go next to someone who's widely considered to be the leading dissident intellectual in this country, or one of them, Noam Chomsky. He's a professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Chomsky's written and lectured on international affairs, U.S. foreign policy, and contemporary issues. Just one note before we get to the end of the program, we will give out those phone numbers that were just mentioned again. But coming now to you, Noam Chomsky, all this discussion that immediately preceded you on this program about what exactly was there at the Sudanese plant, is it really relevant? Is this really the point here?
It's of some interest, but it's not the main, in my opinion, it's not the main point. I mean, let's assume that the United States has completely credible evidence that the plant is producing components for nerve gas. There's no reason to believe that, but let's assume it. Then the U.S. act is simply an act of international terrorism. There's no, the international law, and indeed our own Constitution, is quite explicit on this. In the case of the concern about a threat to peace, a law-abiding state is required, obligated, to go to the Security Council, present its complaint, and ask the Security Council to respond. There's no relevant exception to this, and the administration knows it perfectly well. They've claimed an exemption under Article 51 of the UN Charter, but that's simply ludicrous. I mean, all one has to do is read the wording of it to see how nonsensical that is, and the fact that it's taken seriously by commentators in the press is a comment on them, not on the law. So the real question in my mind is, do we or do we not take seriously the position of the administration in justifying what it's done? If we do take it seriously, that means that any state in the world, or in fact any group in the world, has a perfect right to set off bombs, say in Washington or Tel Aviv or London or wherever they like, if they believe or claim to believe that those countries are involved in acts of violence against them. And there's certainly no shortage of evidence. I mean, let's take the most obvious example, Cuba. Cuba's been the main target of terrorism for 40 years, since October 1959, when planes based in Miami started bombing Cuba. There's no enormous secret about it. The Kennedy Operation Mongoose operations were extreme terrorist acts which killed probably hundreds of people. And it goes on in years following with all sorts of terrorism. It goes on until the last known act is last summer, when it is conceded, even finally by the New York Times, that the acts were carried out by the world's leading terrorist, Luis Posada Carrillo, who's got a long CIA connection back to the Bay of Pigs, and that the Miami groups were involved. So that's certainly, and it killed an Italian visitor and caused a lot of damage and so on. That's quite recent. So surely, by Clinton administration standards, Cuba has every right to set off bombs in Washington or New York. And then we can go down a long list. I mean, that's just one. Well, plainly, the administration doesn't intend its position to be taken seriously because of the consequences. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that we don't take the position seriously, and we recognize that the U.S. simply considers itself to be, recognizes that it's the most powerful state in the world, and it can do what it feels like.
You're listening to Noam Chomsky. Stay tuned. We'll be back with you in 60 seconds. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!, sitting in for Amy Goodman. I'm Laura Flanders, and with us on the line is Noam Chomsky, who's speaking to us from his vacation in Massachusetts. Professor Chomsky, we may or may not take the president's line seriously, but just for the purpose of discussion, in his effort, in the administration's effort to defend their decisions yesterday, in addition to fanning out anonymous government sources, the president released a letter, the letter that he had written to Congress on the night of the bombing, explaining his actions and so on and so forth. In that letter of August 20th, he wrote that he had authorized an amendment of a 1995 executive order that declared a national emergency and justified all sorts of actions against terrorists, quote, in the view of the danger posed to the national security foreign policy, and economy of the U.S. by activities of Osama bin Laden that disrupt the Middle East peace process. That was the pretext. That was the principle or the justification for the extension of this executive order from 1995. The danger posed to national security, foreign policy, and economy of the U.S. by activities that disrupt the Middle East peace process. If you take that at its face, what is really being said here? What is that danger?
Well, first of all, remember that those declarations and the wording are routine. They're produced by presidents regularly whenever they want to do anything. So, for example, in 1985, President Reagan, on May 1st, he chose Law Day, presented exactly the same declaration, except that instead of bin Laden, he referred to Nicaragua. The dangers posed to the national security and economy of the United States and so on by Nicaragua justify us in carrying out a terrorist war against Nicaragua, which incidentally was condemned by the World Court. And this continued. The United States was in a state of emergency, national emergency, through the 80s. People may not have noticed it. This happens whenever the president wants to do something. As for disrupting the Middle East peace process, first of all, we have to raise a question about whether it's possible to disrupt something that doesn't exist and never has existed. What's called the Middle East peace process is simply the U.S. triumph after 20 years of extreme rejectionism, in which it blocked every effort at diplomatic settlement and negotiations. Finally, after the Iraq War, the U.S. was in a powerful enough position to ram through its own highly rejectionist proposals for a kind of Palestinian Bantustan. That's what's called the peace process. So it's hard to disrupt. It's like saying that somebody was trying to disrupt South Africa's peace process in the early 60s when they were establishing Transkei and so on. Even to talk about disrupting the peace process or the peace process is to accept propagandistic assumptions that no serious person should accept. That what's called the peace process is a U.S. rejectionist program held in international isolation for 20 years until they could finally ram it through. However, if we talk about disrupting this U.S.-initiated Bantustan program, well, in fact, the person who's disrupting the U.S. program at the moment is Netanyahu and the EQed government. And there's a lot of talk about that. But even that talk is misleading because it presupposes that there's something serious to disrupt.
Well, coming back to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the U.S. aspects of the story, what are the economic, for example, interests to which Osama bin Laden poses some kind of danger?
He poses any threat, but that there's a much broader threat of which this is a very minuscule part. A much more serious example of the threat was last December, last fall, when the U.S. was trying to build up, last fall and early spring, when the U.S. was trying to build up support in the Middle East region for the planned attack against Iraq. And couldn't do it. It got overwhelming opposition. The U.S. organized a Middle East economic conference in Qatar. I think it was December, and nobody would show up except Israel. And at the same time, in fact, very dramatically, right at the peak of the Iraq crisis, it wasn't reported here, but right at the peak of the Iraq crisis, it was in sort of March, I think it was early March, the Saudi government, Saudi Arabia is the main concern. That's where all the oil is, most of the oil. The Saudi government invited former President Rafsanjani of Iran on a state visit, and went way out of the way to treat him with great pomp and ceremony. Met the king and so on and so forth. At about the same time, Madeleine Albright was there and was given the back of their hand. Wouldn't barely talk to her. And in fact, the high princes, the royal family, which basically owns the country, they made it clear that they were seriously considering moves towards accepting long-standing Iranian proposals for rapprochement and establishment of some kind of regional security system in which the United States would be marginalized. These countries are very concerned not just about U.S. support for Israel, but also for the very rapidly growing and now quite visible Israeli-Turkish alliance under U.S. aegis, with joint military maneuvers and U.S. and in Israeli jets, meaning U.S. jets piloted by Israeli pilots, carrying out maneuvers in eastern Turkey with the obvious intention of threatening Iran. These are advanced jets that the U.S. has sent, very sophisticated. I don't think NATO even has them, which can fly to Iran and return without refueling. This is a very definite and serious threat. It's part of a long-standing U.S. program, goes back many years, decades, to try to control the oil-producing regions with a sometimes called a peripheral alliance, an alliance of primarily non-Arab states, almost all non-Arab states, that will make sure that the riches of the region, which are enormous, flow to the West, primarily to the U.S. and secondarily the United Kingdom, rather than to the people of the region. And that causes plenty of opposition. It leads to what's called radical nationalism, opposition to the U.S. presence and power in the region, where people simply can't get it through their heads that the oil wealth is supposed to benefit Westerners, primarily Americans, not them. They're kind of backward in that way. And this is a long-standing problem. It's getting much more serious. Saudi Arabia and Iran are historic enemies. In fact, technically, there's still a war over Iranian occupation of Saudi Islands under the Shah. And the rapprochement is extremely serious. The United States is certainly worried about it. The long-term, it's not so long-term. If you look a decade or two ahead, and planners certainly do, the Middle East oil-producing regions which are the main center of energy for the next generation or two at least. They are becoming more and more important. The rate of oil discovery has declined since the mid-'60s. It was going up until then, even with high technology and bringing more expensive resources online and so on and so forth. And the general projections are that over the coming years, the Middle East region will be even more significant as an energy source and a source of profits. And the U.S. surely has been a prime concern of U.S. policy to maintain its domination of that region. This extends now to the Caspian region, which is nowhere near the Gulf, but is significant enough.
So just to clarify, you're suggesting here then that this bombing, this missile attack on Sudan, Afghanistan, Sudan in particular, wiping out 50% of the medical supplies of that country, is an exercise in signal sending to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I mean, remember, Sudan and Afghanistan are pariah states, kind of like Libya. Nobody's going to defend them. Furthermore, they have no means of self-defense. So it's a sort of free bombing. I mean, you do it for free, just the way the United States used Libya as a punching bag right through the 1980s. You know, anytime you needed something for domestic purposes, attack Libya. This is quite safe. Nobody's going to defend them. Everybody hates them, including the people of the region, including their own population for the most part. So, yeah, you can send a signal that way.
Now, one other part, as we are kind of unpacking the administration's rhetoric itself, albeit without the help of the administration spokesperson who is going to be with us on the program, one of the other arguments, one of the other pretexts for this attack has been to take a stand against terrorism, to wipe out those who would wipe out the U.S., what the U.S. stands for in the world, and that would danger and intimidate Americans.
What does he stand for? Well, what he stands for is opposing the U.S. what he calls the U.S. occupation of Saudi Arabia. That's what he stands for.
What about the effectiveness argument? Even if the threat argument is clearly, up for debate, as you put it, or disputable, what about the idea that there even could be some effectiveness to targeting like this, an assault
like this?
Of course
there could. I mean, the U.S. certainly knows that. I mean, let's go back to Cuba. The U.S. attack against Cuba, which is the major terrorist attack in international terrorism in the current period, has been very effective. The U.S. terrorist war against Nicaragua was extraordinarily effective. I mean, Israeli terrorism in Lebanon, which means U.S. terrorism, which goes back many years, has been very effective. If the U.S. is interested in deterring terrorism, it doesn't have to go very far. It can start right in Washington.
And when we were talking at the very early part of this interview about the Middle East so-called peace process, as you put it, the U.S.-backed Bantustan program, Israel and Israel's treatment or dealing with so-called terrorists has been adopted as a model, even referred to as a model in this debate.
That's quite interesting how they did it. There was a long report of quoting all the top terrorologists, specialists in terrorism in Israel and the United States, on exactly that theme, saying, now the United States is taking over the Israeli policy. And they gave a very interesting example as their lead example, which of course they applauded. It was an Israeli terrorist helicopter attack in Lebanon, north of their security zone. Security zone is illegally occupied, but forget that. North of the security zone in Lebanon proper, which they don't even claim, a helicopter attack shot a rocket at a car. They were trying to kill Sheikh Moussaoui, who's a Hezbollah leader, and they did kill him and his wife and his infant child. This was in 1992, and that was what was given as the example of the model that the United States should be following. Well, it's an interesting example. I mean, as every one of them knew, anyone who pays attention to these affairs knows, up until that time, Israel's northern border was quiet. There were no Hezbollah rocket attacks in northern Israel or other attacks. Even though Israel was carrying out constant terrorist acts in Lebanon, in the security zone and beyond it, Hezbollah the Shiite retaliation, the retaliation of the Lebanese peasants, basically, whoever organization they're in, was against Israeli forces and their clients in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, the security zone. After the attack on Moussaoui, the retaliation started hitting northern Israel. Now, the way that's been described, and that's what led to Rabin's invasion and later Shimon Peres's invasion, the last one in 1996, including the huge Kana atrocity, which were described here as Israeli retaliations against Hezbollah terrorism. Well, you take a look at the interactions and you discover that the Hezbollah terrorism, so-called, began after the murder of Moussaoui and his wife and child, which is presented as a model. And in fact, that terrorism was overwhelmingly retaliation to Israeli terrorist attacks, which prior to the Moussaoui murder had been focused within the Israeli occupied territory. So that's the model. Now, it is inconceivable that any of the people they quoted doesn't know all of this, but I'd check and see if he saw a word about it.
And while we're talking about words, let's close where we began, which was with some discussion of the media coverage of all of this. I mean, stenographers to power hardly even describes the situation now. The relationship has become much closer, it seems, with today the press carrying the words of this anonymous government representative. What do you make, really, of how this story is being covered here, and where can people go for analysis that would take them a little deeper into understanding what's really going on?
Well, in all the press coverage that I have seen, there's been virtually nothing that even bore on the issue. One exception to this was a letter published in the New York Times by an international law professor who pointed out that whatever the facts are, the United States simply has no authorization to use force and violence. That's the policy of Nazi Germany, or Saddam Hussein or something. So the whole discussion is beside the point. So one letter did mention the point. There were other reports which are of some interest, So, for example, the August 20th was the date when you mentioned Clinton sent the letter to Congress. It was also the day on which the Archbishop Tutu, South African Archbishop, who's the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, released documents, South African intelligence documents that they'd discovered, indicating that British and U.S. intelligence were involved in the planning and probably implementation of the murder of Hammarskjöld in, I think it was September 1961, where his plane blew up, and they found documents showing U.S. and British involvement in the planning of this and probably implementation of it. Well, that's nice timing, so that was kind of interesting. But the major, as far as the press coverage is concerned, the prime issue, does the U.S. have a unilateral right to use force and violence whenever it feels like it, a right which, say, Cuba or, Lebanon or other countries don't have? That issue isn't even raised. I can't find a word about it, except for what I mentioned. It is simply taken for granted that the U.S. is a violent terrorist state that does what it likes. Then we get to the secondary questions, whether, what are the effects of what they're doing? Do they know anything about Sudan's chemical plant and so on? And here the reporting is as you'd expect. I mean, government positions are presented as, they lead the story, and if you get down to the bottom of the page, you notice there's no evidence. So, for example, the Times had a very amusing page the other day, internal page, in which at the upper left-hand corner there was, they were quoting the briefing to the senators and how impressed they were with the ironclad evidence that the U.S. knew exactly what it was doing, and they said that what tied it up was the testimony of Odeh. Then the bottom of the page, in the lower right-hand part, was a report from Kenya, where the head of the FBI investigation said, "We don't know anything. He won't talk."
Noam Chomsky is a professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and considered, I think, by many to be one of the leading dissident intellectuals in the United States. I'd like to thank you for being with us here on Democracy Now!